The following is a lecture delivered to a group of educators by Alfie Kohn, author of Punished by Rewards.
When I do a smaller workshop, and it begins by asking people, as I will ask you now, to reflect on the following question. What are your long-term goals for the kids you work with? What would you like them to be like, long after they've left you? And then I ask people to reflect on the list. This is a part of teaching that my teachers rarely did. After a given unit, to say, let's, before we move on, ponder what just happened and what it meant. What do you see on this list? And I will short-circuit the process tonight by telling you the kind of things that show up on this list all over the country. See if it corresponds to the things you thought of in the last minute. People say, I want kids to have healthy self-esteem so that even when they screw up, they know they're basically good people. I want them to be risk-takers, to be curious, to be problem solvers, successful, caring, compassionate, generous people, socially skilled, lifelong learners, stuff like that. The interesting thing is that even when I'm working with teachers of older students, the list looks the same. Nobody has ever said, my long-term goal is for kids to know the difference between a metaphor and a simile, or how to work a binomial equation or something of that sort. Never has it happened. Now, that's the first part of the exercise. It takes 5 or 10 minutes. The second part of the exercise takes approximately the rest of your life. And it consists of weighing your daily practices against that list of long-term goals. Logically, one of three things must be true. Either what you're doing on a given Tuesday helps to foster those kind of goals, or is irrelevant to those goals, or most disturbingly, actually impedes those goals. And my sad, discouraging observation visiting schools around the country from pre-K up is that a huge proportion of the daily practices, even by very thoughtful and caring adults, actually gets in the way of meeting not necessarily my goals, but the goals that we ourselves as a community have for kids. So here comes the central proposition I then offer, which I offer for your consideration tonight. The only way to reach those kind of goals is by working with children, not by doing things to them. That prepositional shift makes all the difference. Now that sounds like the kind of phrase that's one of those feel-good after-dinner talks that I promised not to give. Everybody nods. Yeah, let's work with kids. Don't do things to them. But wait, before you immediately dismiss that as hollow rhetoric. It's actually a very radical statement given how much of the time we spend doing things to kids. We do things to kids in particular in two ways. We punish them and we reward them. Now, very few people, especially who work with young children, readily endorse the concept of punishment. So instead, in order to continue doing this, we use euphemisms. And in particular, one big euphemism, we don't even talk about it as punishment anymore. We call it consequences. And we seem to feel that if we stick in the word logical or natural, we can pretend we're not punishing kids. The whole idea of so-called logical consequences is what I call punishment light, L-I-T-E. It's a kinder, gentler way of doing things to children. And if you want to know whether it's really the same thing in terms of being a difference in degree only instead of in kind, don't turn to me, and certainly don't turn to those textbooks and seminars. Look in the children's faces, and you will get your answer. Oh, we love euphemisms. Oh, we don't like to call it forcible exclusion and isolation. We call it timeout, and pretend it's not a punishment. Under this podium, I have a gun, and I take out the gun, and I show you it's loaded by shooting at the ceiling. Bam! And I convince you I am nuts enough to use it, and I say, anybody talks in here for the next hour and a quarter, you get shot. Will it get quiet in here? I think it will. Question. Do consequences work? Answer, yes. They work very well to get one thing, and only one thing: temporary compliance. That is all any consequence, or whatever other word we want to dream up for it, can ever get. What is a consequence or a punishment? It basically is a way of making somebody suffer to teach them a lesson. Oh, we may do it more gently and reasonably and respectfully, and we may have some kind of conceptual connection between the punishment and the crime, to which I say, so bloody what? The point is still that we are visiting some unpleasant situation on the child, making the child undergo something aversive, or preventing the child from doing something he or she wants in order to change the future behavior. You can call that punishment, you can call it a logical consequence, you can call it a popsicle. It doesn't matter. All of it is fundamentally effective only ever at temporarily manipulating the behavior, and at terrific cost. First of all, it's counterproductive in the long run. Research has shown for 50 years that kids who are severely consequenced at home are more likely than other kids to act out when they're away from home. Does that surprise anybody here? Again, notice what that means. Not merely that punishment is ineffective, but actually counterproductive. What else is wrong with it? It makes people angry. It ticks people off, even very short people. It makes people defiant and resistant, just as it would make you feel that way if I was somehow able to use what authority I have as the speaker to punish you. So it is for children. It makes them feel lousy about themselves, and it makes them feel lousy about you. Consequences rupture the relationship between you and the child. So now the child comes to see you as an enforcer of rules, an imposer of consequences, and is about as happy to see you coming as you and I are to see a police car in our rear view mirrors. Query what the effect is of that on the caring alliance that is necessary to help kids become responsible, caring, decent people. It does another thing. It models bullying. It teaches power. So the child, rather than focusing on how he or she is acting, what that means and how it affects other people and what could be done instead, is focusing on the fact that you are bigger and can do bad things to make people comply. The real lesson they learn is not how to be a responsible person, but wait till I'm around people who are smaller than I am. Sometimes that happens, or weaker, or both. Sometimes that happens in the same afternoon. And we then return and see, boy, this kid is really trouble. More consequences. Tighter control. And of course, the circle keeps spinning right into the ground. What is the question that a child comes to ask herself or himself in a consequence-based environment? What do they want me to do, and what happens to me if I don't do it? You say to a kid, hey, don't let me catch you doing that again. Kid figures, all right, next time you won't catch me. And that's a perfectly logical response. Perfectly logical. But notice the fundamental truth about so-called consequences that have been ignored by virtually every person commending them to us. When we talk about the consequences of an action I do, we mean the consequences to me. This is the lowest level of moral development, and we adults are the ones responsible for it. Not what is the consequence of my actions to other people, but what will the consequences to me be if I do something a powerful person disapproves of. You know, I hear people say a lot, this really rankles a lot of people. Yeah, I'm sorry, that sounds good in theory. Already I'm worried. These people typically don't think it even sounds good in theory. That sounds good in theory, Kohn. But in the real world, you learn there are consequences. Kid grows up and robs a bank and gets caught. There's going to be a consequence to pay. Let's think about that for a minute. We want kids not to grow up and rob banks because they know that's wrong. The use of consequences does not give them one shred of reason or wherewithal or moral sophistication to figure out it's wrong. The only thing that child has been led to think about is, if I rob a bank and get caught, what's the consequence to me? So if the kid thinks he can get away with it, he has been given a green light to rob banks. That has nothing to do with helping kids become ethical people. Are there grown-ups in our country who only stay doing approximately the right thing because they're afraid of what the consequence to them is if they get caught? Sure. Are those the kind of people we want our kids to grow into? Regardless of what we call it, doing things to kids by making something bad happen to them if they don't follow our rules can get short-term obedience, but at the cost of significantly impeding moral growth and social progress. Now, for many of you who agree that punishment is bad, my first big gulp for the evening, or is that things have not changed substantially merely by calling it a logical consequence. Now here comes an even bigger gulp. It's the other flavor that control comes in, and it's called rewards, or the euphemism many of us prefer, positive reinforcement. And that's disturbing to a whole lot of people who say, I try not to punish, I reward instead. That's the right way to do it, right? I try not to criticize, I praise. I try not to be negative, but be positive. I try to catch kids doing something right and give them positive reinforcement for it. And the bad news, folks, is that rewards and punishments are not opposites. They are two sides of the same coin. And the coin doesn't buy very much. Oh, it buys something. Forget about the gun. I was just kidding about the gun. I don't like guns, even toy guns. Here's what I've really got under this table. I've got several suitcases filled with checks made payable to cash in the amount of $1,000 each. There are about 1,200 of these. Here's the deal. If you sit for the remainder of this talk with your right leg crossed over your left leg, and I have monitors clandestinely stationed around the room to check for compliance. Incidentally, note, one of the many things that punishments and rewards have in common is that they both require surveillance. If I receive a report back from your secret row monitor that you have obeyed and crossed your legs in the appropriate manner, what does appropriate mean? That's right, whatever the heck I say it means. Then we will be standing here at these doors as you file out and hand you a check for $1,000. Will you do it? Are you kidding me? Anybody with two legs will cross one over another for $1,000. So, do rewards work? Yes. They work to get one thing, and only one thing: temporary compliance. Sound familiar? Now, for years and years, behaviorist researchers, after the fashion of B.F. Skinner, you know of whom I speak? Man who did his research with rodents and pigeons and wrote his books about people, that B.F. Skinner? When I was in college, in a very behaviorist experimental department, the only thing we did other than sit passively and drool during lectures was to train rats to press a bar by feeding them Rice Krispies. Now, laboratory rats are typically starved to 80% of normal body weight, so there is not very much they would not do for a little breakfast, and we were able successfully to train them. However, this will surprise you, but I was a bit of a troublemaker at the time, so I wrote up my lab report from the rat's point of view. Talked about how incredibly easy it was to condition college students to engage in breakfast feeding behavior, and I nearly failed Psych 1. I know it was a sophomoric thing to do, but then I was in my second year of college at the time, so it seemed only appropriate. Now, for many years, the behaviorists have told us that organisms are more likely to emit a particular behavior if they receive a reinforcer for it, and all the rest of it is just variation on that point. What kind of reinforcer, how often you get it, on what kind of schedule, and so on. In the early 1960s, 2 doctoral dissertations were published by coincidence in different parts of the country that used human beings as the organisms, and the tasks were a little bit more complicated than banging a bar. One researcher used kids, the other used adults. They took the whole group and gave them a challenging task to do, and half of the people were told, just here, see if you can solve this, and the other half were told, here's what you get if you solve it. And both found, contrary to hypothesis, when you see that phrase, you know you're on to something, that the first group without the reward did a better job. By now, there have been some 20 studies that have shown, when those studies first came out, they stirred up widespread apathy. Nobody noticed, nobody cared. And to some extent, that's still true. But now we have study after study after study showing that in terms of bottom line performance on tasks, as one researcher wrote in 1971, quote, rewards have effects that interfere with performance for reasons we are only beginning to understand, unquote. They didn't even know why it happened, and some people still don't, but they had to admit it happened. Contrary to the way we lead our lives, raise our kids, teach our students, manage our employees, dangling carrots in front of people does not typically produce better performance. But what about changes in behavior? The answer is that those changes typically don't last longer than the rewards. When the rewards are gone, people go back at best to doing the way they did things before. But sometimes the news is even worse than that. Like punishment, rewards are sometimes counterproductive. One study recently, for example, with adults was an anti-smoking campaign in which different kinds of programs were used, one of which was a financial incentive paid to people who quit. Those people in that program went back to lighting up more often than people in other kinds of programs, but also more often than people in the control group. That is, people who are not in any program. Now here comes a research report that will be more relevant possibly to you and more distressing. 2 recent studies have found that children who are frequently rewarded by their parents were less generous than other kids. Does that surprise you? A moment's thought reveals that what those kids have learned is that the reason for helping is that they will get a goodie. No more goodie? No more reason to help. Indeed, less reason than when they began, given other possible motives and senses of oneself that can lead to caring being a lifelong habit. Rewards, like punishments, are ways of manipulating behavior, ways of temporarily controlling the superficial actions that people engage in. They do nothing to develop a commitment to the behavior itself. Now, for B.F. Skinner, that sentence is nonsense because there is nothing to us other than our behavior. Hence the term behaviorist. But for most of us who believe that behaviors merely reflect and are informed by the way we think and feel and will and remember and plan, then merely changing the behavior would not be expected to produce positive effects over the long run. I mean, if a kid does what you want him to do in order to get some reward, it wouldn't be accurate to say that kid was behaving himself, as we say in English. More accurately, we would say the reward is behaving him. And that change will not last, because good values have to be grown from the inside out. Why do rewards fail, both to promote long-term behavior change and better performance at work and at school and elsewhere? Besides what I've already said, I want to mention a few reasons and then tease out some of the implications with you, and then talk about, broadly speaking, how I see the alternatives to doing things to children. First reason that rewards don't work is because they are, in the long run, aversive, just like punishment. That's why I call my book Punished by Rewards. The best phrase I have ever read about rewards was written a few years ago by two of the leading researchers in the field at the University of Rochester. They said, rewards are just control through seduction. Let that stay on your tongue for a while. That is exactly right. I know Skinner didn't like punishment, although for reasons I believe were pretty superficial. What I'm suggesting is that there is a critical difference between the goodie itself, like a gold star or a sticker or an ice cream or a candy bar or an A or a dollar or a toy or extra privileges and on and on and on, or verbal doggy biscuits. More on that in a minute. There's a huge difference between the thing itself that is desired and using that thing as a lever to get somebody to jump through your hoops. That's what makes a reward a reward. In one word, it's contingency. In everyday language, do this and you'll get that. I say to parents all the time, you want to take your kids out for an ice cream treat on Sunday? Do it! But what you should never do is say, if you're good this week, we'll go out for ice cream. Does the kid want the ice cream? Do you want the $1,000? Of course. But what nobody wants is to have the things he or she desires or needs offered in order to manipulate behavior to get compliance. In the long run, that feels aversive and thus punitive. So now, take all the stuff about punishment that I was rambling about before, all the research and the data, and bring it over here because it applies to rewards too, and helps to explain why rewards like punishment cannot be effective in the long run at getting those long-term goals we're looking for. I mean, there's also rewards when they're expected and not received are more directly and concretely punitive. We've all seen kids expect to get some goodie and for whatever reason not get it. How do they feel? You tell me the difference between that and punishment. The behavior is saying, no, that's something else. We have a different word for it. But if you haven't read their technical writings, you may just be ignorant enough to feel punished. But the main point, my main first point, is that rewards are attempts to control by virtue of being offered contingently. And though we want the goodie, we don't like being controlled, and so you can bet the rent that in the long run this will backfire. Reason two is that rewards rupture relationships. And I have in mind here two kinds of relationships. Those among kids and those between kids and adults. Now, I don't think with you that I have to start from the beginning and explain how important relationships among children are. We're not just talking about cooperative learning as kids get into elementary school as a technique that helps kids like themselves more, like each other more, like what they're learning more, and learn better, although all of that is true in well-functioning cooperative learning. But the idea of connection to others, the importance of developing relationships so kids feel part of an us, is vital to almost any long-term goal you would care to name. Unfortunately, rewards get in the way. Kids who are scrambling to get goodies are not kids who are building community and developing relationships. Of course, there is one kind of reward system that is guaranteed to destroy community, and that's called competition, which I'll be speaking on tomorrow. So we'll let that go now, except for one sentence. Can't resist. One sentence. And the sentence is the central message that all competition teaches, all competition, is that other people are potential obstacles to my success. And that is a message that is descriptively false and prescriptively poisonous. My point is, even if, sorry to tease you there, one subject at a time, one book at a time, one day at a time. Hey, I got a bumper sticker there. I love taking our pulse with bumper stickers. Have you seen the bumper sticker that says, I don't get mad, I get even? Why doesn't it just say, my mental health is so precarious that I have to brag about being vindictive? My child is an honor student at... And in parentheses, and yours isn't. I saw one that said, My child made it through the metal detector at Springfield High. Yes, we take pride where we can. Let me finish this point. If you say, I agree with you on competition, more importantly, I agree with the data about the destructiveness of competition, so I try not to set kids against each other. I make sure all the kids can get stickers. All the kids can be praised. All the kids can get rewarded. Then what you have done is to peel back a layer of problems to reveal another mess of problems underneath. You have taken, to use another metaphor, a big step forward, in my judgment, by moving away from competition. But you are still rewarding and thus controlling and thus doing things to kids, and there's another step yet to be taken. There's another kind of reward system that has a similarly destructive effect on relationships, and that is that dreaded monster called group rewards or collective rewards. If we're all on our very best behavior, notice the use of first person, even though, of course, the adult's behavior is not relevant, then we will all get to do this. You know, the Geneva Convention rules out collective punishment. I think it's time we take a hard look at collective reward. What happens if the teacher says, I'm sorry to say, boys and girls, we were not on our best behavior this week, snatch, and the reward is yanked away, rather than properly resenting the adult for dangling this goodie and then removing it? Kids often designate a goat, one of their own they believe is responsible for their not getting the reward. This is an ugly, ugly kind of peer pressure that is the very antithesis of community. But it is not only the relationships among kids that are affected, also the relationship between kids and us. In the context of punishment, I mentioned not long ago that if kids come to see us as enforcers of rules and dispensers of consequences, they're about as happy to see us coming as we are to see the highway patrol behind us on the freeway. But what if instead we are handing out rewards instead of consequences? How then do they see us? As goodie dispensers on legs, perhaps? Notice how fundamentally different that too is from the caring alliance I mentioned before. A gulf has opened up between you and a child. If you are the person who gives out the punishments or the rewards, it's still doing to, not working with. And that causes kids to try to flatter us, impress us. And as they get further in school, to try to pretend they have everything under control. Because if they say, I don't get it, I need help, that may jeopardize their chance of getting the reward. Few things are more destructive to improvement than a bunch of reward-driven individuals trying to pretend to infinite competence. So rewards have this effect among kids and between kids and adults, and that's my second reason why I think rewards tend to be counterproductive. Here comes reason 3. Rewards ignore reasons. Here comes a startling statement of such blinding clarity and originality, you're going to be glad you came to this conference just for this sentence. You ready for this? If you want to know how to solve a problem, you have to know what caused it. There's insight for you, huh? And yet, when we use rewards or consequences, we act as if that weren't true. As if it were possible to bribe or threaten the problem out of existence. True story. I gave a talk about rewards to a parent group a few years ago in Virginia, and a videotape of that was shown to some people, one of whom wrote me a letter. Dear Mr. Kohn, you have just taken away all my tricks and techniques. That's her phrase, which I think is an apt one. So what am I supposed to do? She continued, reading between the lines here, Mr. Smarty Pants. With my little girl, I put her to bed at night. Okay, sweetie. Okay, we got a big day tomorrow. Okay, sleep tight. I love you. See you in the morning. Close the door. Bam, 3 minutes later, she's out of the room. I put her back into the bed. Bam, she's out of the bed again. I put her back to bed, and she's out again. What am I supposed to do? I thought, all right, fair question. Let's think about how most child advisors, parenting experts, you can hear the quotations, would respond. Basically, the responses come in 2 flavors, bribe and threat, even though they don't call them that. Threat goes like this. Young lady, if you are not back in that room before I count to 5, can forget about that trip to the zoo we talked about. The bribe approach goes like this. Honey, if you spend all night in your bed for the next 4 nights, I'm going to buy you that big teddy bear we saw in the toy store window. First comment, notice how fundamentally similar these two approaches to manipulating behavior really are. So what would I say? I frankly would not have the arrogance to prescribe a solution until I had at least a dim idea of why this particular child this week was having trouble staying in bed. What are some possible reasons for this? Cited about something coming up, or something that just happened in school that she's got to rehearse in her mind. What else? There are monsters under her bed. Why else? Just had dessert. Why else? Not sleepy. Yeah, maybe you're putting her to bed too early. It's time to rethink the bedtime. TV shows, something she wants to do. Or maybe she can just hear what's going on in the rest of the house. Is there anybody here too old to remember how all the most exciting stuff happened after we were put to bed? Or maybe she just wants to spend this time cuddling with her mom or dad and is reluctant to call that time to a close. Or maybe. We could come up with a lot more reasons. Here's the point. It's breathtakingly simple. Each of these possible explanations for the problem calls for an entirely different course of behavior, a different course of action on our part. We don't need to go over what we would do in each of these instances, I trust. Rewards are so popular because they pretend to be a one-size-fits-all solution. Many of you know that's a lie in clothing. It's also a lie in behavior. And it's one of the reasons I get so frustrated when people say, no rewards, what's the alternative? Instant response. And I'll say in a minute why another reason makes this perfectly reasonable sounding question makes me agitated. But this reason is simple. There isn't an alternative. There isn't a solution on the same level as bribes or threats. If that's what you're hoping I'm going to get to at the end of this talk, you're going to be frustrated. We seem to want a solution that's both easy and effective, and if we can't have both, we'll take easy. That's why rewards and consequences are so popular. So if we don't get anywhere near where the trouble is by getting at the core of the problem, then of course we can't expect to have solved the problem, and we have another reason to explain the data showing that rewards don't work. By the way, I know many of you are listening to this with 2 ears, as daycare workers or teachers, educators, but also as parents. And clearly this stuff applies at home and at school and in other places as well, including the way people treat you at work, I might add. I've lost count of the number of teachers who are really bent out of shape at being manipulated, at being controlled, at having no say about what they do, at being bribed or threatened. And then they turn around and do exactly the same thing to the kids they work with. Maybe that's a frightening paradox, or maybe it's simply what's predictable. You pass down the control from above. Just for symmetry's sake, I should mention that, as I've said before, question a child is led to ask in a consequence environment is, what do they want me to do and what happens to me if I don't do it? What is the question a child comes to ask in a reward-oriented environment? What do they want me to do and what do I get for doing it? Notice how fundamentally similar those two questions are. And note how different either is from the question I think we want kids to grow to ask, what kind of person do I want to be? Even if they can't quite articulate that at age 4. That's the kind of direction we want them to move in. And my argument to you is that stickers and stars and pizza and ice cream as rewards and even praise can actively distract and deflect from that kind of question. What kind of person do I want to be? What kind of community do we want to have? And that leads me to, there are a couple of others I describe sometimes when I have more time or with teachers of older kids. How many of you work with kids kindergarten or younger? Can I see hands? All right. I think we'll skip the getting into college problem here then. No, I figured, of course, it was young children. The Y didn't stand for, I don't know, yellow children or something. But I wanted to know how young, and that tells me. Let me skip now to the last and most important reason of all to explain the failure of rewards. Rewards? How many of you have heard the terms intrinsic motivation or extrinsic motivation? Virtually everybody. Over and over again, I find that many teachers are familiar with these concepts and the distinction between them, and then go to work and act as if there were no important distinction. Here's the central myth about motivation. We act as if motivation were a single entity that you can have more or less of. So we want kids to have more of it. So we try to motivate them as if it were possible to motivate somebody else, which it isn't. Anybody tells you, here's how to motivate your kids, you should run screaming in the other direction. You can't motivate somebody else. What you can do is create an environment, climate, a structure in which kids desire to find stuff out, to respond to other people's needs and so on, is allowed to blossom, to flourish. I say that's all you can do. It's one heck of a lot. Anyway, we act as if there was this single entity of motivation, but in fact, the question we should be asking is not how motivated are kids to do something. The question we need to ask is, how are kids motivated? You get the difference? The question is not how much motivation they have. The question is what kind. Because if their motivation is extrinsically oriented, which means if I do this, then something else will happen, we have a problem. Not only because that is inferior to the kind of motivation that is intrinsic. Intrinsic motivation is basically a fancy term that means you love what you do. I am assuming, given what the educators of young children are paid in our society, that you are not in this for the money. Is that a fair assumption? And you'll notice, by the way, that in no way is my challenge of rewards an argument against money, any more than it's an argument against pizza. It's an argument against using money. So I actually talk to corporations about the problem of pay for performance or incentive plans or bonuses or merit pay. And when executives say, how should we pay people? I say, pay them well. Pay them fairly, and then do everything you can to take money off of their mind if you want excellence. Now here, too, notice what's going on. It's not just that intrinsic motivation is better than extrinsic. It's that intrinsic motivation is undermined by the use of extrinsic motivators. Let me put that differently, and this is my fourth, and I think, for me anyway, most telling reason. The more you reward someone for doing something, the less interest that person will come to have in whatever he or she was rewarded to do. More than 70 studies have determined that that is true. It is one of the most thoroughly researched findings in the field of social psychology. Over and over and over again, with children and adults, they offer them tasks to do, and some of the people are rewarded and some aren't. And the people who aren't, if the task is at all interesting, continue to do it on their own time later. But the same kind of people, given the same bloody task, but are rewarded for it, do not gravitate back to that task on their own time. The exposure to the reward is enough to cause the interest in the task or the commitment to the behavior to begin to evaporate. Overwhelmingly, this is true. Now you see why parents who reward kids for being generous are undermining generosity? Here's a study I love. This one was done in Illinois by some people who don't even study rewards especially. They study food preferences. And in particular, they looked at a drink called kefir. K-E-F-I-R. You know what this is in California? Do you know? Oh, yeah. Okay. Trust me, between here and Cambridge, nobody knows what this stuff is. In Cambridge, you're required by municipal ordinance to drink this stuff. If you don't know, if you're from, say, Bakersfield or somewhere, not putting down Bakersfield, I'm simply suggesting it's a kefir-free zone. Kefir is a tart, yogurt-like Middle Eastern beverage that comes in different fruit flavors. So here's what the researchers did. They took a bunch of kids, and they divided them in 3 groups. And the first group was just given kefir to drink. Here, drink this, okay? The second group was praised lavishly for drinking it. Good boy, you drank all the way to the bottom. The third group was offered movie tickets if they drank enough of the stuff. Okay, first question. Skinner or some other behaviorist would predict that the kids who got the tangible rewards, the movie tickets, or the kids who got the verbal rewards would drink more kefir than the kids who got no reward. Is that what happened? Yes. I set you up. Remember, give rewards, including praise, their due. They can get temporary compliance, just like my getting you to cross your legs for $1,000. But that's not what these researchers wanted to know. Their question was, how would the kids feel about kefir a week later? Guess what? The kids in the first group, just given the kefir to drink, liked it as much or more a week later. But the kids offered the movie tickets, and contrary to hypothesis, the kids offered the praise, basically no longer wanted to touch the stuff. Who cares what kids think about kefir? I don't. But now substitute for kefir reading, or responsible behavior, generosity, or enjoying playing with ideas, and you get a glimpse of the destructive power of rewards. The more they are rewarded for doing it, the less inclined they are to do it. Why is that true? If we had more time, I'd engage you in a conversation about this. I'll short-circuit that. Basically, I think my reading of the research is two reasons account for this phenomenon. One is rewards, as we said before, as I said before. I always hated teachers who said that. Yesterday, we talked about the Civil War. No, you talked. I wrote notes. If it's going to be a lecture, I might as well own up to that. Before I said, what did I say? That rewards are controlling. I quoted somebody saying control through seduction. Well, that helps to explain why people get less interested in the whole enterprise, because they don't want to be controlled. Another explanation is that merely by saying to somebody, do this and you'll get that, they devalue the this. In other words, somebody figures if they have to bribe me to do this, it must be something I don't want to do. So if you say to your kids at home, all right, honey, do all the math problems, including the extra credit problems, and you can watch an extra hour of TV. What does this teach? Math sucks. Whatever the reason is for this phenomenon, though, it happens over and over again. You are familiar with this program for slightly older kids, are you not? Sponsored by Pizza Hut, called Book It. You heard of this? People at Pizza Hut decided, let us assume for perfectly altruistic reasons, that kids are not reading enough. Since we have count 'em, theories of motivation in this country, Skinnerian behaviorism, the solution is obvious. You bribe kids to read. So the way the program works is for every so many books the kid reads, the kid gets a certificate that is redeemable for free pizza. So a few years ago, I was talking to my friend, an incredibly astute educational psychologist, John Nichols, great loss, not well known. So I was talking to my friend John Nichols about this program, and I said, John, what is the likely effect of this program, do you suppose? And he said, the likely effect, mate, is a lot of fat kids who don't like to read. Can I buy the behavior of reading? Can I get kids to open more books in this program? Yeah, if they like pizza a lot and can't get it any other way. But what does it do to their choice of reading? Hint, watch for a run on short, easy books with big type. Second, what does it do to their comprehension of what they've read? And third, and most importantly, what does it do to their interest in reading when the program is over? I got 70 studies to predict that most kids, though not all, happily, will be less interested in reading when this program is over. Our fearless leader, the big Newt, now wants to pay kids $2 a book. This is his program from West Georgia. This is the only thing better than a cheap applause line is a cheap hiss line. Newt Gingrich last week took his program Learning by Earning nationwide from West Georgia College. Pay kids $2 a book for every book they read. If I was asked to think of a plan to destroy kids' interest in books, I couldn't top that. That's what the research says. And I trust that all of you who are clapping understand similarly the effects of other rewards, like parties and stickers and special privileges and the like. Because it's not just the fact that it's crude and crass dollar bills that's the problem here. Problem is extrinsic motivation itself. That's the problem. Now I'll tell you a story. I tell this story, if you don't like studies, maybe you like stories. This is one of my favorites. I tell this every time I speak, even when I speak on irrelevant topics. That's how much I love this story. Once upon a time, there was an old man who lived near an elementary school. And every day after school, some of the mean kids on their way home would stop by the old man's house and yell up at him the nastiest things they could think of. Hey, you stupid old wrinkly prune! Hey, you bald-headed! Even worse stuff I can't repeat here. Well, the man was tired of this abuse, as I think you would be too. And one day he came up with a plan. The next time the kids came to shout their taunts at him, the old man comes out and he says to them, "Kids, if you yell this stuff at me again tomorrow, I'll give each one of you $1. Well, this was a big surprise. Even more of the kids showed up the next day, and they yelled even more loudly about how stupid and ugly and wrinkled and disgusting the guy was, and to their amazement, as promised, he comes out and he pays off his hecklers. There you go. Here's your $1. Thank you very much. If you come back and do this tomorrow, I'll give each one of you $0.25. Well, that wasn't as good, but it wasn't bad. So they showed up the next day and hollered at him for all they were worth. And once again, the guy came out this time with a roll of quarters, and he paid him off again. Here you are. There's your $0.25. Thanks for coming. Hey, if you come back tomorrow,
I'll give each one of you a penny. Kids could hardly believe their ears. A penny, they said. Forget it. And they never came back again. This is a very serious story. Let us analyze it and kill the humor, which is what happens when you analyze jokes. Trust me, I know. I actually wrote my graduate thesis on the psychology of humor. It was years till things were funny again. The kids taunted the guy because they found it fun. They were intrinsically motivated. As soon as they were rewarded for doing it, came to see themselves as doing it to get the reward. When the reward was no longer there, neither were they. That was the old man's plan. But it's not your plan. And yet that is what millions of well-meaning teachers, daycare employees, and parents are doing every single day. Systematically killing off kids' generosity, responsibility, eagerness to learn by bribing them to do the things that they're supposed to do. Now, some of these things are worse than others. It may surprise you to learn, for example, that I am not quite as exercised over the idea of M&Ms for potty training. I don't like it. I think it's manipulative. I think it's often done to kids before they're really ready and so on. But the reason it doesn't bother me so much is that we are not concerned to instill in kids a lifelong love of defecation. The Pizza Hut program, however, makes me boiling mad. Just like all the other reading incentive programs or catch kids in schools being good citizens and give them some goodie for it. Here's the rule of thumb. The more you want kids to want to do something, the less inclined you should ever be to reward them for doing it. That's the rule of thumb. All right. Those are the 4 reasons. That's the research on rewards. The point is that rewards like consequences are ways of doing things to kids. But before going on to talk very quickly about how I see another approach, a few words about praise. Am I saying you can't hug kids and smile at them and be excited? Of course not. What I am saying is that the vast majority of examples of praise that I see done with young kids really does amount to a verbal reward, and thus the same problems, potentially destructive effects can be predicted. What rewards tend to do when they work is to get kids more and more dependent on getting the approval of that praise giver. Now, sometimes they don't work. With some kids, and whenever I talk to elementary schools teachers, I ask them, have you ever seen this? You praise a kid and the kid acts out even more afterward. Maybe even with younger kids you see this sometimes. What's going on there? Why should that happen? It is not an anomaly. What is happening there, and I think there's several possible explanations, but here's one. The kid knows that the most striking feature of a positive judgment from you is not that it's positive, but that it's a judgment, and nobody likes to be judged. And that kid knows that the big thumbs up today from you could be a thumbs down tomorrow, and that kid is trying to reclaim some of his autonomy by distancing himself from the whole enterprise. And I say, go, kid, go. Most kids, though, especially younger children, and especially in our culture, girls, are much more likely to respond to praise appropriately. Their faces light up. They glow with delight and try to figure out how they can get that same reaction from us tomorrow. Those are the kids I'm really worried about. Those are the kids who I'm afraid may grow into praise junkies. Even as adults, unable or unwilling to reflect on what makes an action good or what makes a piece of work commendable, instead needing that pat on the head that says, good girl. Children, especially young children, are hungry for our approval. And that places on our shoulders an enormous burden not to exploit that need for our convenience. Here's the example I think I like least. I like the way Jennifer is sitting so nice and quiet and ready to work. I'll just mention 3 of my objections to this common practice. I have a couple of others too, but I'm running out of time. Number 1, you have just set into being a competition for nicest, quietest child, and the rest of you just lost. So much for community. Second, This is a fundamentally fraudulent interaction. I am using Jennifer to manipulate the behavior of other people in the room. And that is just not a nice way to deal with human beings of whatever age. Probably never thought of it that way before. Third reason. What is the most important word in the sentence I spoke? I'll say it again. I like the way Jennifer is sitting so nice and quiet. You're already there. The most important word is I. All that Jennifer has learned from this utterance is how to please me, not the way her actions affect other people, not how to solve or negotiate problems, only how to jump through the hoops to get the pat from the powerful and loving adult. Some people say to me, I've heard these questions. One teacher said to me, I have 2 kids who are so insecure. How can I not praise them? And I said, have you ever considered that the more you praise them, the more insecure they become? There's research to this. This makes kids more tentative, more likely to say things, always looking to you to see, do you like this? Is this okay? I have another objection, gets even more to the heart of the matter. People say, God, do you have any idea the kind of homes some of these kids come from? Savage, loveless places. And you're telling me not to praise them? Yes! What these kids in particular need, hell, what we all need, is unconditional support and concern and attention and, even love. Praise isn't just different from that. It's the opposite of that. Praise says, do this, and you'll get that. Do what I tell you, and only then will I tell you how proud I am of you, and give you a big smile, and a thumbs up, and all of that stuff. Conditionality eats away at the kind of self-esteem we hope that these kids will come away with. Nobody does it that way on purpose. Why do we praise so much? Instead of offering the kind of encouragement that we could offer instead. Encouragement that consists of descriptions of what they're doing. The classic example is the kid draws you a picture and gives it to you. The cheap and easy thing we're all trained to do is, isn't that nice? What a beautiful picture. You're such a good artist. I'm so proud of you. What could we do instead? I notice you put the moon over here way in the left. We could simply describe what we see instead of the middle. How come you decided that? Or, boy, you use a lot of orange. Is that your favorite color? And the other thing we could do is ask questions. How to be a teacher in 4 words. Talk less, ask more. What are you going to draw tomorrow? Notice that these responses give kids what they need. Attention, support, acknowledgement, encouragement, without a single evaluative word being spoken. Without a single evaluative word being spoken. So how come we don't do it that way? Here are my reasons. You think of your own. 1, because to encourage in the way I'm describing, leaving kids feeling more empowered, if you like, to use a cliched word, more in charge of themselves instead of disempowered, which is what most praise does, takes care and time and skill, talent. It takes no care, no time, no skill, no talent to say, that's beautiful, way to go. So it's quick and easy. Second reason we do the cheap and easy kind is because it gets results. I like the way Jennifer is sitting, can get kids to sit down in a hurry so you can pick somebody out. But at what cost? And is there another way? Third, we do it because it was done to us. It's what we know. Some teachers are actually evaluated based on how often they praise kids. Fourth reason why we do it, despite its destructive effects. For some of us, not all of us, deep inside, praise gets a sense of power for us. And it feels good to have a whole bunch of people, even real young people, looking to us to see what we think. Got to introspect for a while to see if that touches you or if it doesn't. Last reason, simple one. When we've been brought up this way, it feels chilly or sterile at first not to praise, as if we're withholding something. And I got to tell you, of all the stuff I teach about, this is the hardest piece for me to do in my own life. And I came to realize I was praising so much more because I had to say it than because they needed to hear it. And whenever that's true, it's time to take a good hard look at what's going on. So this is not an argument to stop smiling and loving and encouraging. It's an argument to take a look at the kinds of responses we're giving and the extent to which they may be just like stickers or contingent ice cream cones. You know the program Assertive Discipline? This is the polar opposite of a caring democratic community. It's a way of making the trains run on time. It's a collection of bribes and threats to get kids to mindlessly obey whatever the adult says. It's the polar opposite of everything I've been arguing for. Guess what Lee Cantor and Assertive Discipline emphasize at least as much as consequences? Praise. You think that's a coincidence? It's another mechanism for control, for doing to, whether you meant it that way or not. So what's the alternative in the broader sense of this word? In a few minutes, can only lay this out very, very briefly. First of all, in case I forget to say this later, let me say the following to you. If any of you are sitting here thinking, as I talk about logical consequences, as I talk about rewards in general and praise in particular, if you are sitting here thinking, oh my God, I do exactly what he's talking about. Does this mean I'm a bad teacher? If you are even asking this question, I mean this sincerely, it probably means you're a very good teacher. Because what could be higher on the list of what makes for a great educator than the willingness to rethink your practices and premises? The people who say, I don't care what his research says, rewards work. Or, I'm not giving up praise. Those are the people I'm worried about. The people who say, oh my God, this sure wasn't a feel-good speech. I want my kid to be in your program if that's how you react. All right. I said there was another reason why I got frustrated when people said, no rewards, what's the alternative? Here's the reason. And it took me a while to figure this out. If I tell you, you can't get to work tomorrow the way you usually do because there's construction, or around here, mudslides, or earthquakes, or floods, or fires, or locusts, and you said to me, Alfie, what's the alternative? I have no problem with that question. I go, okay, when you're going to go past the freeway and take a left by where the bank is, and then you're going to go around, blah, 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 blah. How come I can answer that question of the alternative so easily in this case? Because the goal isn't at issue. We both understand that the objective is to get you from home to work, from here to there. But if you say to me, what's the alternative to rewards or consequences with kids? Suddenly the objective is the key. Because to be very honest with you, if your real objective is to get kids to sit down and shut up and do what they're told, then I have no alternatives. Bribes and threats are the best we've got. But if your goals are closer to those long-term objectives I mentioned at the beginning, then don't ask me what's the alternative to rewards. The very question presumes that rewards are already getting us toward them. So you're saying you better give me something better if you want me to let go of this. And my whole point for jumping up and down sounding like a televangelist here is that rewards, like consequences, cannot move us 1 millimeter in the direction we want. They're moving us away. So the question's not what's the alternative to rewards. The question is, God, doing things to kids can't help. For this stuff we care about, what can? Okay, here are half a dozen. And to the extent you're interested, some of you, and I'll check in with those who decide to come to my presentation on competition tomorrow morning, we can start with some elaboration of this stuff before going on to competition, depending on what people there want. Basically, the answer is the alternative to doing things to kids is working with kids. Thank you, and good evening. Yeah, but what does that mean, and how do you do it? This is where it gets more interesting. The first point I would make to you on a positive note is to question your own requests. To have the guts not to take for granted the way all those damn books and seminars do. You ever notice this? Parent guides, classroom management seminars, always take for granted whatever the adult wants to get is appropriate. Here are some tools for getting it. That's why those people are millionaires and I'm not. Because I ask the unsettling question, is what you're asking reasonable or appropriate, developmentally appropriate or otherwise? It's much easier to just say, whatever I want goes, tell me how to get it. If a kid is not sitting still for a long period of time, at lunch, rather than saying, show me how to make him sit still, I want to ask, why do you need him to sit still? And is that something a child of that age can reasonably be expected to do? And so on. Point 2, let's assume we've passed this test, and yes, you're quite sure it's something reasonable and appropriate, is to minimize your own control whenever possible. The least amount of control over children's actions, including praise, is the most desirable. How many of you are familiar with the word constructivism as an approach in education, and could give, if asked, a lucid definition of it? Suddenly the hands vanish. I'm not sure I could. I'm still working to understand it. In a nutshell, Constructivism is an approach, is a description of how kids learn, not just a prescription, and how adults learn as well, that says we are not passive receptacles into which knowledge is poured, but active meaning makers struggling to make sense. And the people who've done most of the work on constructivist thinking have introduced things like math manipulatives and discovery and project-oriented science, and an approach to art and problem solving. Some of you may have seen the amazing work or heard of work in a town in Italy called Reggio Emilia. There's a book about their work called The 100 Languages of Children, and whole language and all of this stuff comes basically to some extent out of this tradition. What we have to do is to take the constructivist approach and apply it to kids' social and moral development. And I will recommend a book to you now more than any other book on this topic. It is the best thing I have ever seen on this topic. If this is what interests you, I'd say read it before you read my stuff. And you know that's going something when an author says that. The book is called Moral Classrooms, Moral Children. Moral Classrooms, Moral Children. And the lead author is named Rita, R-H-E-T-A, DeVries, D-E-V-R-I-E-S. Rita DeVries is a constructivist thinker who has done work in math and science and now is doing work in saying the same approach has to be applied to kids' social and moral development, where we minimize our control over kids. Part of constructivism with academic development, intellectual development, means moving away from getting kids to memorize right answers so they can think their way inside of the thought. So, for example, if a kid says 4 and 4 are 9, the correct answer, a good response from you would not be, I'm not like some of these people in Northern California who say, well, if 4 and 4 are 9 for him, that's valid, okay? What I am saying is that if we want to get kids to understand mathematics, then a better response to 4 and 4 are 9 is to say, how'd you get that? Which is not a bad response when kids say 4 and 4 are 8. Because the point is not just to memorize the right answers. That doesn't lead kids to understanding. Now, here's the key point for those of you who have already thought about this. The same approach of moving away from right answers has to be applied to how kids deal with each other, to social and moral development. The point is not to get kids to spit out a rule you want. We should keep our hands and feet to ourselves. Now remember, what's our rule, boys and girls? It's not our rule, lady. The rule is not the point. And even if you decide to get kids to come up with a bunch of rules, the rules they come up with are not the point. The point is the process of reflection and challenge, of figuring out how we think we should be with each other. Or as Rita DeVries says, the objective of cleanup is not to get the room clean. This is too much? You see the point. Talking about how the room should look and how we should solve the problem of people leaving a mess is a teachable moment. And the process is much more important than the product. Here is an opportunity for kids to think and feel their way into the matter of how we want to be as people. And that's far more important than the fastest way to get the room cleaned up is for you to clean it. Sometimes you do. If two kids are having a conflict, the fastest way to solve the conflict is for you to solve it, to do things to the kid. But conflict is not like dandruff, where the point is to get rid of it as quickly as possible. Conflict is an opportunity to say, what could we do here? Not for you to take control to get results. That's the key point. I was in a kindergarten class this past Monday, and on the wall I saw this amazing thing. I knew I wanted to sit around and revisit this classroom. There was a chart up where the toilets had been flooding down the hall, and this was a teachable moment. And the teacher got these 5-year-olds to think about what are some possible things that could have made the toilets flood. And I don't just mean items in the toilet. I mean, what could have made this problem happen? And they then had representations of what each of them had said, so they could see spatially represented the number of votes that each of these hypotheses got. And then they talked about what can we do to make sure this problem doesn't happen again? And each of those things were written out. We are looking at social skills, moral skills, and intellectual skills, because the point was not for the teacher to control the situation. The point wasn't even to get to the speediest and most expeditious solution. It was to say, here is how intellectual and social and moral development can happen, by moving back, by saying, now when do you step in and say, I'm sorry, this conflict could injure a kid. Something has to be done now, or not. When do you say, I want to model for kids helping, and so see them helping? Or when do I want to say, no, I want to give them a chance to solve the problem on their own? There are no formulas here. Those answers are the sort of things that it takes a long time to develop your craft and get good at. The flip side of minimizing control is to maximize choice for kids. So the first response out of your mouth when there's a problem is, how do you think we can solve this problem? And not saying that in a way where you're fishing for what's the right answer, which a lot of people do, but really an attempt. You know, kids learn how to make good decisions by making decisions, not by following directions. And by the way, when I talk about maximizing choice, I do not mean the examples that I call pseudo-choice, that go like this. Would you like to finish what you're doing now, or would you like to stay in during recess or playtime to do it? We use choice like a bludgeon here, and like a disguise, because what we're really saying, let me translate to the kids, is, do what I tell you or I'll punish you. But we use the language of choice, and it's never mind that we've reduced it gratuitously to 2, the number of options, and never mind that no kid would want to miss that, so it's not really a choice at all, miss the good stuff. The point really here is, if you want choice, it means reflecting from the beginning about how we want our room to be, not do you want to do it on my terms now or my terms later. Very quickly, a couple of the other things. We've got to look beyond behavior. Whenever I see any classroom management book that talks about getting better behavior from kids, I'm already worried. Because as soon as you're focused on behavior, you can bet the rent that rewards and punishments are going to be used to try to elicit that behavior. What I care about is not just the actions of children, but their motives and the values that inform the actions. Here is a kid who has just shared half her cookie with the kid sitting next to her, hoping I would notice and say, Debbie, isn't that a generous thing to do? How sweet of you to share. I'm so pleased. Here is a kid who shared her cookie with the kid sitting next to her, not knowing or caring whether I saw it, because she's worried the other kid's going to go hungry. The behavior seems to be identical. I don't care about the behavior so much. I care about why kids are doing it, because I want kids to come away with a sense of self. I am a helpful person. And the more you reward or praise generosity, the less likely you are to get that. Even our explanations can push in precisely the wrong reason. Now, Max, if you share your big wheels with Rhonda, maybe she'll let you play with her dinosaur. This does not promote caring. This promotes self-regarding shrewdness. It is an appeal to naked self-interest that is likely to dilute whatever care about other people's well-being the child started with. But we think because it promotes the behavior of sharing, it must be a good thing. How likely is this kid going to be to invite somebody else to play when there's nothing to get in return? Beyond behavior. And in fact, that leads to my next point, which is, and I think will be my last point, which is the importance of helping kids to focus on the impact of their actions on others. Martin Hoffman at New York University has been talking about this for decades under the label inductive discipline. If a child does something really nasty, we make it clear this is not acceptable, but not because I say it's bad, not because it breaks the rule, not because it makes me angry, but because of how it affects the victim. No, Stephen, we must never kick anybody like that. Look at Roger's face right now. You remember when you tripped down the stairs last week and your leg was hurting and you were crying? That's the way you've made him feel now, and we never want to make people feel that way. The trick here is to do it in a way that is powerful, so the message gets across, but not in such a way that power becomes the message. Conversely, what do we do with the kid who has shared her cookie? Inductive approach is, wow, Look at Marcia's face now. She's so happy because she gets to eat some of that cookie. Doesn't she look like her day is made now? You made her feel that way. Notice how different that is from praise. It's not, I'm so proud of you, I approve, but look at the effect you had on somebody else. That's exactly the opposite of consequences and rewards, where the impact is on the person who does the action. There's a lot more, both specific and general principles of what it means to work with. That's just a taste of the approach that is not only more respectful and nice, but more effective in the long run at helping kids to become decent people. Adults who reward and punish are not nasty, evil people. We live in a society where we're encouraged to focus on behavior and to get control. But if we want kids to become responsible, generous people in the long run, there is something else we can do. The bad news is that the doing to approach is pervasive. The good news is we can do better. Thank you.